Right, good afternoon. I think we're live with our webinar. We're just a minute past 12, so we're just going to go probably give another 30 seconds or so just to let everyone in and get signed up. The good thing is we've had a fantastic response to this webinar, so I think there'll be quite a lot of people trying to join. So just going to give it 30 seconds before we formally start. Yep, so I can see that a lot of people are joining. Okay, so first of all, welcome everybody. Massive thank you for taking the time to join us today on our webinar titled "The Risks of Alcohol and Drug Misuse at the Work." As I said a few seconds ago, this has been one of our most popular webinars that we've run more recently. We've had quite a high number of people wanting to attend. So I think from our side, it just demonstrates how important this issue is at the moment. And the kind of content that you'll see on the screen, which I'll just run through in a second, will hopefully support you and answer any sort of key questions you have. Before I do that, just around questions, is the way that the format's going to work today is that I'm going to do some introductions. James is going to do the bulk of the presentation, but we have a functionality that if you do want to ask any questions as the webinar runs along, you can put your question into the Q&A box. And then we've allocated about 15-20 minutes at the end of the session just to go through some of those key questions. Myself, James or Joe will answer anything we can. If we don't get to your question though, we will get back to you after this event and respond to you. Just another quick point as well is that at the end of the session, there will be a slide which will have all our contact information on there. So if you don't have a question now, or you just want to contact us separately, all that information will be there, and it'll kind of stay on the screen while we do the Q&A. So there'll be plenty of time to make any notes or anything along those lines. So without further ado, we'll get started. So for the next hour, this is the agenda. So we're going to start off with just a quick overview of kind of who we are as people, and then also a quick overview of who Hampton Knight are and the wider Medigold group. We're then going to go through some sort of key information, signs and symptoms of alcohol and drug misuse in the workplace, talk about the different types of drugs, so all the different effects they may have on the body and what they're called and terminology and those kind of things. We're then going to look more specifically at the wider workplace, so in terms of key stats and how drugs and alcohol affect the workplace in that respect. And then we're going to get into some details around policy and also the purpose of the policy and how it can be applied to the workplace. And then the final point before we get into the Q&A is we're going to go through some of the key testing types, why testing is important, and how you can implement that from a business perspective. So, quick introduction. So my name is Michael Wakeham. I'm the Client Services Director at Hampton Knight. Also joined by Joanne Hughes. She's the Operations Director for Hampton Knight. And also we've got James Clark, one of our experienced business trainers. If there's anybody on this call that may have used Hampton Knight before, or if you've kind of utilised our training services, you may recognise James. You may have done some of your training in the past, or you may have come across him. So, quick overview of our kind of journey to date. So Hampton Knight have been at the forefront of workplace drug and alcohol testing for coming up to 21 years now. Actually, no, I think we just passed the 21 birthday mark. It was in May, so 21 years now. And in that time, we've developed a number of key sort of services and products which basically are there to support businesses across the UK with their drug and alcohol policy. This includes possibly one of, if not the best collection services in the UK in terms of response times and also coverage. We also have some very well received training packages which can be done both online and in person on sites, which is geared there around sort of awareness. So a lot of the stuff we're not talking about today, but also around if you're doing your own testing, some competency training as well as that. and also all the relevant sort of products and other items that you might need to deliver a alcohol and drug testing policy. But also one of the most fundamental things that we have done over those 21 years is that we've been advising companies up and down the country, all various sizes, from large global multi-site companies down to one-site businesses across all different industries, on how best to make sure that your drug and alcohol policy and testing program is as robust as possible, and also supporting anything after you may get a positive result or any challenges to that as well. So we're very well versed on all the different types of things that you'd need to look at when looking at this topic. Our position was further strengthened in the marketplace in 2017. Very excited to join the Medigold Health family. It was a great match. Both businesses, family owned at the time, very focused on sort of delivering high quality services from a nationwide perspective. And this allowed us to utilize a lot of the scope with Medigold Health to develop our services. And we've really both businesses have gone strength to strength over the last 3 years, which is really pleasing to see. And then the final point just on this is that last year when the COVID pandemic hit, obviously took everyone by surprise, wasn't in any business plans or anything along those lines, but we were able to sort of utilize a lot of our experience around testing, workplace testing, and also our infrastructure to be able to support businesses. Basically make sure that their workplaces, their employees, any people that came in contact with their business, like customers or contractors, they're able to create a safe working environment. So we delivered a number of developed a number of services and products to allow COVID testing to happen. So both PCR and lateral flow testing, again, as well as a lot of training and support services around helping businesses understand what they can and can't do, but also how to implement it from a business perspective. So moving forward, the focus is very much on supporting companies from a COVID perspective, and also to drive forward with our alcohol and drug services. So a lot of work going on at the moment in regards to our technology and service lines, which makes the next few years very exciting indeed. So without sort of me talking too much longer, I'm going to get to the good stuff now and pass over to James, who's going to take you on the next few slides.
Marvellous. Cheers, Mike. Thank you. Right, nice to meet you all, virtually, that is. So as Mike just said, we're going to be looking at alcohol and drugs misuse in the workplace, many different elements of it, kind of a whistle-stop tour of many different elements of this scenario. But the first thing we're going to look at before we get any deeper into it is the drugs themselves, just a better understanding of what we're actually dealing with before we start trying to manage them better in the working environment. And drugs are defined as psychoactive substances, something that changes you physically or mentally, or even both, depending on what you've taken. Now, drugs will typically come from one of 4 categories, the 4 that you can see on the screen. A stimulant category, which is all about heightening the energy levels and the focus and the concentration. The depressant drugs, which do the complete opposite and shut the central nervous system down to start relaxing the body. The painkillers, which is pretty much a medication world, with a few illegals in there as well, and then the hallucinogenic drugs. Now, when you look at each drug group, there's obviously lots of legal and illegal elements in each one. For the stimulants, you know, you'd have tobacco and coffee, but you'd also get ecstasy and cocaine. For the depressant drugs, you'd get alcohol and forms of medications. You'd also get cannabis. The painkilling category, codeines and morphines and tramadols, drugs that we're all very common with in terms of pain relief, but also heroin, methadone would be in that type of category. And then the hallucinogenic drugs, which is pretty much very different types of substances, magic mushrooms, LSDs, ketamines, even things like ecstasy and cannabis, which drop into a different category, also turn up in this section. Now, even though you have these drug groups in society, obviously, which is a lot of where the problem is, we want to deal with and look at today, obviously, the workplace element. And it's covered by typically 4 big areas: prescription drugs, which are medications, obviously, similar to over-the-counter drugs, which are legal and allowed, and we can consume them, obviously. Alcohol, and then some illicit substances. And in the workplace, the best way of looking at this is, even though you've got legalities, legal drugs, illegal drugs, It's better to view it from a use or misuse point of view, because policies can easier manage that. And what I mean by that is, if you look at an alcohol, for instance, a very legal drug above a certain age within the country, and you're allowed to consume it, but just like the drink drive limit, whereas if you were drinking too much of that legal drug and got caught by the police under the influence, it's similar mindset in the workplace. Yes, alcohol's legal. Yes, you can consume it, but at work there are limits of how much alcohol is too much, what risks health and safety. And on the flip side of that, cannabis, which is an illegal drug and obviously shouldn't be in your body, that particular substance will still create medications. We have very legal cannabis medications in this country. So at work, if I was on a cannabis medication, which I had a prescription for, I'm not misusing that drug. I'm using it in line with the policy because it's a medication that's making me better. So sometimes, yeah, use or misuse is a better way to look at this as opposed to legal and illegal. There are still illegal elements, obviously, but yeah, use or misuse is a much better avenue to go down when you're trying to deal with this sort of thing at work. Now, for these drug groups then, as we mentioned, there's 4. So for the stimulant group, as I already said, you've got tobacco, energy drinks, caffeine would be legal elements, but a lot of illegal elements, especially the more recreational drugs, tend to drop into this category. So speed, ecstasy, cocaine, crack cocaine, methadone, lots of illegal substances that are either Class B, Class A, Class C drugs. Now, in general, people tend to use these for almost like an energy release. These drugs don't physically give you energy. It's more about unlocking the energy that's already in your body. But you can see from the top 2 bullet points there on the screen, dilated pupils, hyperactivity, they're the very common effects of these drugs. But it's quite short-lived. So it's very rare that you see someone looking like they're under the influence of a stimulant at work. Like I said, they're usually drugs that they use recreationally. Even though they're not allowed to, they are using them recreationally in their private lives with quite a short-term effect. What you are likely to see, though, which we'll look at in more detail in a bit, is the opposite effect of drugs. So when you look at the stimulants, and you look at more of these bullet points, anxiety, depression, impaired judgment, excessive sweating, inability to make correct decisions, that's not a typical kind of instant effect of a stimulant. It's kind of the side effects that come down from the drug or the misuse or continual frequency of using these particular drugs. And I want to come on to more about that kind of additional side effect in a little while. The second category we mentioned was the depressants. So there's a lot of legal elements in here. Alcohol would be one. Medication, things like Valiums, temazepams, benzodiazepines, drugs that we typically use for depression, anxiety, insomnia, these types of conditions. So very legal drugs. But the big thing about these types of drugs, just like alcohol, there are limits, there are controls. So obviously the Medicines Act comes into play around medication. And a lot of these kind of benzo type, depressant, anxiety type drugs, if you don't have a prescription for them, become Class B drugs. You need to have prescriptions to use them. So again, that's something we're going to look at in a little while about how we manage these situations in the working environment. What you'll also get, though, in this category is one of the most commonly abused drugs in the workplace, the drug that fails more frequently than any other drug in our testing profile, which is cannabis. And there is many elements to this. Obviously, the illegal element. There is also CBD oil, which is very legal now in this country and allowed. There's also cannabis medication. But as I said at the start, someone's on a prescription with a cannabis med. It's a prescription, it's allowed, it's governed by the Medicines Act. Someone's using CBD oil, completely allowed. You can buy it off the high street in Holland and Barrett, a very legal substance now. But obviously the recreational form of it is still very much illegal, Class B drug, and obviously shouldn't be in anybody's system in the working environment. But what you'll see from these 2 lists is the initial bullet points could be any of them. So spatial awareness issues, slower reflexes, poor coordination. You could potentially say that legal drugs like alcohol and medication are more dangerous in the working environment than the stimulant list that we just saw. When you think about someone, under the influence of one of these, poor coordination, slower reflexes, and judging distances is a recipe for an accident. And this is off the back of a legal drug, hence why we have governance around them. You've also got the cannabis list at the bottom. Slightly different how it can affect people. Drowsiness, mood swings, paranoia, even schizophrenia. Cannabis is no longer the recreational drug it once was back in the 60s. It's developed a lot over the years, has a lot of chemicals in it these days. On the last count, when I was looking into some reports, 190 different chemicals contained within cannabis that's sold on the street. So yeah, it has that potential to trigger things like schizophrenia now. It's very much moved on than the relaxant drug it once was. You've then got the painkiller. So with these, if you definitely look at the middle of this list as well, clammy skin, watery eyes, shallow breathing, chills and sweating, definite side effects of a pain relieving drug. But that could also be someone using a heroin, which comes from this category, or it could be someone maybe suffering with something much more serious like a stroke or a heart attack. So one of the big things we'll look at in a little while, especially around alcohol and drugs policies in the working environment, is fairness and appropriateness, respecting people's privacy, understanding that what someone is displaying at work might not actually be what you think it is. It might not be a substance or an effect of a drug. It could be a medical complication. So it's always about treading carefully when you're seeing people at work potentially under the influence, because it could be something else. And then the last category, hallucinogenics, not something you typically get a massive problem with in the working environment. You know, there aren't many people using LSDs and magic mushrooms in society, let alone in the workplace. But what you need to think about with these hallucinogenic effects, there are some drugs that can jump categories and be more than one thing. And as I've already mentioned, ecstasy and cannabis, which are stimulants and depressants respectively, also have this hallucinogenic side as well. So again, you know, you could be seeing somebody behave in these very strange ways, very sudden, bizarre behavior changes, kind of split personalities, interpersonal conflict, and almost look like a mental health problem, when in fact it could just be a cannabis. It could be something unrelated to what you're thinking it is. So it's really good to kind of have good awareness within your business across the workforce about the effects of these drugs and what they look like. And as we've just mentioned, the main effects on the users are initially after using the drug, the short-term effect that the drug creates. But there are bigger issues as well. There's hormonal effects as well. So going off topic just slightly for a few seconds, there's a chemical in your brain or hormone in your brain called CRF. Now, this is released from your brain when you're under stress, and it has a knock-on effect through your body, through your pituitary glands, adrenal glands, and it kicks in other hormones. CRF triggers something called ATCH, which is a very long word, so I like to use the abbreviation to say it. That also triggers other hormones and ultimately gets down to your adrenal glands and your kidneys where cortisol is released. This makes its way back up to the brain, and cortisol, as long as the stress isn't too high, can then stop the release of the initial CRF hormone and kind of compress and slow down that stress within your system. Now, I know this is an alcohol and drug session, but the only reason I've mentioned that kind of stress response, hormonal response in our body, is that a lot of substances, including a lot of the illegals like cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy, also trigger the response of this CRF hormone from our body. So the effect that our body can feel is not only the effect of the drug, but it can almost feel like a stress to the body, and it creates the same hormonal effect. So if someone is continually misusing substance, be it legal or illegal, they can almost create, like I said, an equivalent stress response in the body by doing something that they actually did because they thought they was enjoying it or it was giving them pleasure. The problem with this is it puts a lot of your hormones out of sync then. And once cortisol is out of sync and it can't control this perceived stress response, there's a good 4 or 5 other hormones that then get affected or can do. One is melatonin, which is your sleep enhancer. It helps our body kind of switch off and sleep. One is serotonin, which is our mood enhancer. The second one would be insulin, which is very closely connected to cortisol. And typically when cortisol is high, insulin is slow and vice versa. And that one controls blood sugar. Cortisol, as we already know, the stress hormone, and then ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone, which controls how we eat. So even someone who isn't feeling pressured or stressed, just the use of a drug, like I said, can put their body into such a state hormonally where suddenly they're getting knock-on effects to their sleep, their energy, their immunity, their decision-making, their food choices, all can be affected just by the use of a drug. And like I said, it can almost look stress response. So it's really important to think that, like I said, that there's more than just the obvious going on sometimes. And as you can see here from the screen, what typically happens to the user then as they're using these substances, initially they start to have an issue with absenteeism or lateness because of not so much the drug, but that hormonal response I've just mentioned. As that becomes an ongoing issue, or if it isn't, what you then tend to find is there's a productivity problem. they can't focus, they've not got enough energy, they're not sleeping properly or fueling their body properly, or the body is stressed, so they just can't put a good output out. So their work quality might not drop, but their output might drop. And then ultimately, the worst thing that could happen is obviously accidents and incidents where the impairment is so big, either from the drug or from the hormonal effect, that they go on to cause accidents or incidents or damage or injury to somebody, or a collection of everything that I've just mentioned. Now, with some of that in mind, obviously we could chat about that section quite likely for hours. But moving through the session, we're going to look then at 3 different elements in a bit more detail. So meds first. Now, meds is kind of common sense in the working environment, in the fact that it is legal. We can use our medications to get better, obviously, but we need to follow our prescriptions and we need some common sense. So we would always advise employers that they're talking to their employees about medication, about this common sense approach, about seeking some advice from a GP or a pharmacist about any medications they were taking to find out if there's any potential side effect. They may be being told things like, you shouldn't operate machinery, you shouldn't work at height, you're going to be lethargic. Things that a business would need to know. And in confidence, it's a very good idea to obviously be approaching employees and saying, you know, seek this advice, come forward confidentially, talk to your manager, talk to your HR departments about what you've been told by the professional, by the GP about the side effect. And we can just look at your job role, make sure there's no safety critical element. And if there is, and required to do it because of the med you're on, just take you out of the safety role. So it's a very common sense approach of keeping people safe at work while allowing them to obviously lose their meds. Now, as you can see from the statistics at the bottom, though, there are some issues around meds. It's reported that there's around about 2.5 million people in the UK using prescription drugs that aren't theirs. And as I mentioned earlier, depending on the med, not all, but some meds become illegal substances if you don't have those prescription for them. So it's very important that the workforce know that, of course, meds are okay. And we need that little bit of common sense, seeking advice process around it. But it needs to be your med and it needs to be taken as prescribed. Best way of looking at meds at work that aren't being used properly, same as being drunk at work. Both these substances are legal. Both of these substances are allowed. But under the influence of them at work could obviously be an issue. The big issue around meds, though, I suppose, around people using other people's meds is that second bullet point. It's reported that there's about 1.5 million people in the UK who are actually addicted to prescription drugs, the majority of which, in terms of the type of drug, tends to be an opioid, a pain-relieving drug, a drug that was originally prescribed to make them better, but ultimately has gone on to cause further issues. Now, at the minute, the NHS spends around about £16 billion a year to deal with drugs and prescriptions, with about 9 billion of that actually coming from a GP prescription for pain or depression or anxiety, etc. So as a nation, obviously, it's good that we have meds to solve the problem. But sometimes it's the only answer. Sometimes there could be other things we could do. And again, management of alcohol and drugs in the work environment could alleviate some of that medicinal need just through awareness and training and education of people. The second group, though, alcohol, again, is very common sense, just like medication, that of course a company can't tolerate somebody under the influence at work, but also can't say you can't drink it when you're not at work because it's obviously very legal. So it's about taking this sensible approach again and saying to the workforce, yes, of course, you know, outside of work, you can consume alcohol if that's your choice. Obviously at work, we can't tolerate you consuming it or being under the influence of it. And again, it's all about awareness. It's about raising awareness to the workforce about the power of alcohol, how strong it now is, viewing it as a unit as opposed to a glass, and trying to get a little bit more education into your workforce about, yes, we know this is legal, but how we choose to drink it through our working patterns. And when you look at the statistics, you can see that there is an ongoing issue still with alcohol in the working environment. It costs the country on average around about £7.3 billion a year to do with alcohol misuse that has affected productivity, accidents and absenteeism. Some of that linked to the hormonal issues that we mentioned earlier. On an average, though, we lose about 17 million sick days each year as a country, again, related to this drug, with about 60% of employers from a recent study saying that they experienced problems due to staff drinking. And also, even though we are a nation that's definitely better with alcohol these days, you think of the drink drive campaigns over the last 20, 30, 40 years, You don't really see them on TV as much. The message got across very well, and as a nation, we brought into that and became much more responsible with our alcohol consumption. However, in the working environment, there's still around about 40% of accidents that are involved or have alcohol involved in it or related to it in some way. So there's still work to be done there, and there's still awareness and training that's needed. Last of all, there's the drug element. Slightly different from the other two, because obviously there's an illegal element. So obviously no company could ever support anyone, obviously, say possessing illegal drugs in the working environment or selling illegal drugs in the working environment. But we still need a common sense approach to it. We still need to think about it in the same way and manage it in the same way. So as I've just said, possession or attempting to sell obviously would be a very serious issue in a working environment. But again, it's about education. It's about educating those that are choosing to step into this illicit world about the risks and the dangers, and offering support and help as opposed to allowing them to continue. And as you can see, the cost at the bottom in the statistics is a lot less, 2.4 billion as an estimated cost, again, to that working environment. But this cost is rising rapidly. The alcohol one tends to stay quite stable, doesn't fluctuate too much. But the drug one seems to be going up a lot, especially over recent years. We believe it's down to a lot of variables, but a couple of key ones. One, the drugs are now becoming much, much cheaper than they once were. They are very much more available than they once were. I don't know if you all saw the report about 12 months ago on the news about the speed of ordering a pizza and ordering cocaine in London. And cocaine over this report was quicker to get delivered to your house than the actual pizza was. And I know that sounds a little bit silly, but with the power of technology these days, it's very easy for drug users and drug suppliers to use media to distribute. And it's a very, very easy process. On top of that cost and availability, you've also got things like social acceptability, normalizing the use of drugs, even though it shouldn't be done. And you combine all those together, and it just makes it easier for those that want to step into this world. In the working environment, though, if you look at that second bullet point at the bottom, UK Addiction do a lot of good work in this country around addiction and supporting people, and I have a lot of close connections to many industries and societies. But they estimate that there's around about 3 million workers each year in this country actually go to work under the influence of a substance, be that an illicit drug or be that an alcohol. And as I've already mentioned, the ONS report from last year, which it typically does every year, reports that cannabis is currently the most commonly abused drug. I'll show you some statistics on that right near the end when we look at testing, which highlights just how common that particular drug is. Now, we could chat about statistics all day. Like I've said, we could just keep going on about them, but it doesn't really tell you much more. So we're going to look at it now from a different angle. We're going to look at it from a business angle, a policy angle, and a management angle in the working environment. Now, for a policy to work, it needs to be very clear on what it's trying to do. Like Mike mentioned at the start, it needs to be robust, yes. It needs to be legally defendable, yes. But it also needs to be fair and appropriate and something that people can comply with. But to do that, we need to define what it is. We can't just write a policy and not tell people what we mean by it. So these 3 words on the screen are 3 real big ones when it comes to A&D policies. Misuse, as I've already mentioned, there's a big difference between using something and misusing something. So for misuse in the working environment, it's typically listed as 3 things. Using any illegal drug would be deemed a misuse. Using any prescription drug in a way that you shouldn't. So using someone else's or using your own that went against the prescription guidance would be classed as a misuse. Or then using any substance, be it legal or illegal, in a way that was harmful or hazardous to the individual. So one of the drug groups we was looking at earlier, Depressants, has a drug called nitrous oxide in it, which is very legal to buy for legitimate reasons. It goes in air rifles, cars, soda stream machines, whippy cream cans. It has a lot of legal purposes. But a bit like the solvent abuse issue that we saw in this country in years gone by, nitrous oxide has become like a modern version of solvent abuse. And even though that's a legal product, it's obviously not safe and against the law to put into your body because it's harmful to do so. So that would be deemed a misuse as well. So even if someone purchased that legal product, like I said, like a glue, for instance, like a solvent, it's misuse when you put it into your system because it shouldn't be there. So it's defined in those kind of 3 ways. So you've got understanding in the working environment. The second one, impairment, needs to be very kind of pinpoint in its definition, because this is the word that chooses and decides whether someone has breached a policy or not around drug use and alcohol use. So for alcohol, this is really easy. It's like a drink drive limit, and policies can set almost like a drink drive limit number that says, you know, in terms of a policy, impairment for us would mean anyone with a breath alcohol concentration above, and then set a specific number, 0.35, which is the drink drive limit in England. Anyone above this limit would breach a policy and therefore be in contravening the rules. So it'd be very easy to define it. For drugs, it's very similar, but drugs is more about the presence of it. The levels do come into it when it's analysed, but for drug, it's more about the presence of that illegal drug, or the presence of the medication used without a prescription, for instance, would deem it as an impairment. And then dependency, with the other two as well, are all very subjective words and very opinionated. But if we're going to support people who have addiction, which unfortunately a lot do, and plays a kind of a key role in any policy, when you think about it, if you've got a policy that says you can and can't do certain things within the working environment around substance, for the person who's got a dependency, they just can't comply with those rules because of the addiction. So it's really important we offer support. But what this is defined as is physical or psychological adaptations to the presence of a drug, almost like that hormonal effect I was on about earlier, and something called PAP, which I'm going to touch on in a minute. It also talks about in this definition that if the substance was abruptly removed, that the person would then suffer because of its removal. If you've ever kind of seen a film where somebody's going through kind of like cold turkey when they're coming off a drug, that's a very extreme way to get somebody off a substance, and a very dangerous way. No one should go cold turkey. There is just as many side effects of coming off the drug too quickly than using it in the first place. But those three words, with many others, such as working environment, business premises, who is an employee, these types of words really do need to get defined very clearly in a policy. So, like I said, it's very clear, very precise, very robust, very easy to manage. Now, for policies in general, there's many legislations that sit behind them. The most obvious one would be the Health and Safety at Work Act. And two real big kind of key elements come into it. Section 2 and Section 7 are the acts. Section 2 points itself towards companies in the UK about providing a safe working environment, looking out for the welfare of their workforce, and having a policy that around alcohol and drugs that tries to do that. And then as employees under Section 7A and B of the same legislation, it talks about that we have our own responsibilities to be fit for work, that there's nothing that we're aware of that could affect ourselves or others, and how we comply and perform and consent with the duties that are imposed on us, i.e. kind of like a do and don't list, an expectation list in a policy of what we should and shouldn't be doing in line with alcohol and drugs. But it's a very easy policy to put into place. In short, though, it should be trying to make sure that alcohol and drugs doesn't affect the working environment, trying to make sure that the environment is not only safe from a safety point of view, but also efficient and effective and still productive. That alcohol and drugs don't affect the workforce, but also anyone that we come into contact with, such as customers, suppliers, visitors, members of the general public. The policy should always then discuss things about what a breach of the policy would be in terms of the impairments that I've just mentioned and the definitions, and outlining what would happen around those types of breaches, what the procedures would be. So again, everyone is fully aware of what would or wouldn't happen. The key thing to all of this, though, is obviously keeping it fair. That bottom bullet point there talks about respecting privacy, and we need to do that. Obviously, we can't tell people through a policy what to do in their private lives, but we can make them aware that they need to be fit for work when they come back. And that fit for work definition is a really, again, key part of a policy. This is about fitness for work, making sure that we're all safe, go to work, do our jobs and go home safely at the end of the day. And something like an alcohol or a drug doesn't affect that and should never affect that. So again, fairly easy procedures to comply with, in all honesty. It's actually harder to breach the policy than comply with it. You'd have to really go out your way to try and do that. Now, in general, to breach an A&D policy at work, you've got to be under the influence, you've got to be in possession, or you've got to be trying to selling these things, which obviously most of us aren't doing. Now, when you think about these policies, then they need to be easy to manage. You don't want it to be too small, but you also don't want it to be too big and complex, which some are. They don't need to be too big in what they need to do, but they need to be thorough. And they ideally need to cover these 4 areas. A reasons area, explaining to people very clearly, very simply, what is the aim of this policy? What is it trying to achieve? What is the purpose? What is the scope? So who does it comply to? In what location? And doing what job? What are we trying to get out of it? The health and safety elements I've just mentioned. What is the purpose? Offering people support so we can help people instead of discipline people if they're dependent on something, for instance. So that's a very easy area to define, really. The second area, though, the roles and responsibilities, is almost like a do and don't list is one way I tend to look at this. An expectation list of what a business wants us to do and not do in the environment. So it's kind of like a tiered system, and you'll always have rules for an employee, which is anyone within that business, which outline some of the stuff I've already mentioned. Don't be under the influence, don't be in possession, don't sell. And on the flip side of that, be familiar with a policy, talk about medications, raise your concerns, simple rules to comply to. As managers, the additional rules they would typically take on board then is obviously the management of that, making sure that if anyone was struggling with issues with substance, that they were aware they could come forward to their manager and discuss them, or to the business. But also as a manager, that the appropriate action is taken if someone was breaching the rules or was under the influence, and that the manager was not turning a blind eye. You know, when you think about the Responsibilities Acts that we have to work to around health and safety, it talks about knowing elements of impairment and making sure we take appropriate action. And so it'd be really important that a manager did that. Above that, in the tiered system, then you'd get kind of a director level and the business level of a policy where they're reviewing it to make sure it's in line with legislation, it's appropriate, it's in line with contracting parties that you work with, etc. So there's always that tiered system. A policy then ideally needs to discuss testing. And if you're going to do testing, which you are allowed, the key thing to think about this is, again, still, this is fitness for work. You know, you're not the testing police. You're not there to enforce anything. Policies are there to use testing as a last resort if you're unaware of what's maybe causing problems. It's a check-in measure. It's an ability to check that someone is fit for work or not fit for work. And that's a much less accusational way to look at this, because it's still not comfortable for an individual when they're asked to do this at work. But if you're going to do that, it needs to do a few key things. It needs to explain what type of test you're going to do, how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it, who's going to do it, and what the limits are. So everyone is fully aware how this procedure works. So when it comes to the legislation, like we've just looked at, the comply, the perform, the consent of the duties that are imposed on us, the policy outlines those duties, i.e. consenting to a test or complying with a test, etc. So it's really important. And that's obviously a big part of what we do as a business, offering those types of support networks out there to do that type of testing for you. In terms of support as well, then, again, this is vital for the main reason I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, there will be people out there who come to work, who have an addiction to something and just can't comply with these rules, even if they try, because of the issues they have. So support networks are really, really key in all of this, helping people understand that what they're doing may be illegal if they're dependent to let's say cocaine, for instance, but as a business, if it doesn't become a fitness for work issue first and they come forward first and disclose it, we can help them with them. And it's obviously much better to support than dismiss around this sort of stuff. But a support network needs to be very thorough. As I've just said, it does play a key role, and a business can support anyone with genuine problems. But that genuine problem is not the only part to it. People need to then accept that there is a problem, come forward and discuss it, or confirm it if asked about it. They need to accept any treatment that is offered to them by a company, like I said, rather than dismissing, and they need to follow through with that treatment. And if they are, people can be treated in sickness absence procedures. They can be supported through sickness absence pay, and they can be supported with their medical complication that they have. And this goes back to the definition I mentioned earlier, that adaptation. If someone's just using a drug, they're not a dependent to it. There's usually a connection. And the Equalities Act can support elements of this medical connection, and it needs a connection to the drug use. It can't just be, I use the drug, I like the drug, I probably use too much. That's just someone choosing. It has to have that, like I said, that genuine connection as to why they're using it, other than just choice. But when that is the case, like I said, a business can support it. It can be a very effective way at getting someone back into the working environment safe, trying to help them beat their problems and allow them to work in a working environment and keep their job, which is vital to their support and their, obviously, their improvements. These sorts of support networks should always be then supported by a business through HR and occupational health teams, and even managers on a return to work phase. But the big thing that we are seeing with all of this at the minute is obviously the COVID pandemic. It's changed how we all work. I don't normally sit on a laptop talking to you guys about these types of things. I'm normally there face to face in training rooms and meeting rooms across the country. But what we're seeing as a business and collectively across the country, when you look at statistics, especially the one on the bottom of the screen, a third of drinkers in the UK since the pandemic started are drinking at an increased level. Some people at a high risk level as well. And what you're getting from the pandemic is, especially around those that are suffering with dependency, addiction, functioning alcoholics, going to work was always their saving grace. Going to work took them away from their problem. It allowed them to be in an environment where their substance wasn't. So it always gave them a break from their pressures at home to drink. With so many people working from home, I'm not saying that's the only reason the drinking levels have gone up, but it is something you need to consider as a business. How is the pandemic around substance abuse or just use in general affecting our workforce? How much of our workforce is now solely working from home or maybe split between the office and home? And how is that affecting their behaviours? Or in this case, how would it be affecting someone who's got an issue? Who, like I said, going to work, the issue wasn't there, but at home, the issue is because they have the ability to open the fridge, for instance. You think about a functioning alcoholic, there isn't any at work and they can function during the day, but trying to function on their laptop, sitting at home in their kitchen nearby the fridge where there's a bottle or drink it, but the pressure is there, the stimulus is there. So we need to think about these things as a business, about how we manage not only an A&D policy in the working environment, but now a very much working environment that's at home for quite a lot of people as well. And it is something that needs consideration and thought, 100%. Around this, though, I mentioned it earlier on, PAP, something I mentioned, stands for personality, appearance and performance. And again, when you look at the statistic at the bottom, around about 75% of people in the UK who are receiving treatment for alcohol and around about 25% who are receiving treatment for drugs are actually in employment. And there's a lot of misconceptions around drug use. It's very easy to maybe say that, a dependent person to drugs is someone who's homeless, and it's easy to make that connection, but it's not a fair connection. It's also easy to say that, okay, a drug user, that's just an adolescent kid who's at university and going through trial and error. Not so much the case. And I'll show you some stats on that in a second. But around dependency, this PAP links back to that hormonal adaptation I mentioned earlier. You had all those signs and symptoms I showed you at the start, which are usually the side effect of the drug. But when you get that hormonal effect and that hormonal knock-on, and you get someone continually using as they would around dependency, that personality, appearance and performance, that adaptation to the drug starts to happen. So you see a slightly different person in the working environment, maybe not someone who looks under the influence, but someone who is behaving very, very differently around those 3 bullet points, those PAP bullet points. And it's really important, especially if you guys are managers, to think about those elements. Why is someone behaving differently? When you look at policies as well, it's about raising concerns that you're aware of in yourself or in others. And that's something that we, again, sometimes have to do as managers within a business to support people who maybe are having issues. On top of that, then, this is the testing element then that I mentioned. So if you're going to have testing in a policy, as I said, you need to explain how that's going to be done. And there's many different ways you can do it. The most common forms would be what's known as a for cause test or with cause test, which would back up the impairment. Someone being at work, let's say smelling of alcohol, there's a potential for cause there because there's a sign and symptom and you're dealing with that symptom and could do a for cause test. You've got pre-employment, which some companies do as almost like an induction phase into the company that's part of the process of getting the job. You have random tests that are legal and allowed to be used, which are almost like a deterrent, that don't say, I'm going to test you because it looks like you're under the influence or there's been an accident, but because you've been selected through the company's random procedure. There are then the alcohol and drugs tests that are done around accidents and incidents, and the company using those to check whether it was an accident driven by a drug or it was something else. And then the support network, so around dependency, like I mentioned, you can do testing through a support network. And a lot of people who come forward and ask for help kind of want that assurance test. It kind of gives them a nudge to stay on the straight and narrow. And as a business, it proves to you that they aren't still using that substance in the working environment. And as we said earlier, around documenting the type of test that you're going to do, because if it's not documented, you shouldn't be using it, only the ones that you put in a document. Again, it's like we said earlier, who's going to do that test? How are we going to do that test? Why are we going to do it? When are we going to do it? All needs to be clearly laid out. And then all the rules around impairment, misuse, dependency, and confirming what that test means are kind of vital. But one thing I mentioned earlier is that misconception. If you look at that bullet point at the bottom, a recent study I was looking into highlighted that the group of people who fail most commonly for Class A drugs are aged between 25 to 34, with 70% of them in full-time employment. Going to those misconceptions I mentioned earlier, yes, there is a connection between drugs and the youth, or drug and homelessness. There's a connection there. But in the working environment, there's also a big connection as well. And these statistics are the one I mentioned earlier. If you look at the cannabis one, these percentages highlight how frequently these drugs fail on our testing, at what percentage. They don't add up to 100% in certain year groups, because sometimes we do get more than one drug fail in one test. But you can see, other than 2016 and 2020, when you kind of expect a lull because of so many people working from home during the COVID year, pretty much always above 60% failure rate for cannabis. And cocaine has climbed from 2013 in the mid-20s, pushing up into the mid-40% failure rates now. And you can see they're on a completely different level to every other drug. Most other drugs are still recreational on what they've always been, but cocaine and cannabis definitely developed and become a much, much bigger issue in the working environment. Now, this is stuff we could chat about forever and a day, to be fair. It's an interesting subject matter, and you could talk about it all day. And obviously training courses can go on 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on the subject matter. But in short, we wanted to try and give you, like I said, some bullet points to certain areas. And the main things to take home from this is, obviously, testing has to be carried out by certified testers. It has to be an approved kit for legal defensibility. A policy needs to be effective. And to do that, it needs to do a few things. It needs to be constantly reviewed and have reviews done on it. It needs to be up to date, well-defined, legally defendable. It needs to be, though, fair and robust and appropriate. It needs to give privacy as well. Education to all of this is key. And not just to maybe say a manager that was managing it, or a business that was putting a policy into place, but the workforce as well. So education, awareness training, support is vital. And that support mechanism is, for me, probably the key element in any alcohol and drugs policy. And I suppose the big take-home point, that bottom bullet point there, remembering that support is just as important as protection. Yes, an A&D policy is there to keep the workforce safe, but it's unfortunately also required for those that need help, and that's a vital part of it. Now, that's the presentation up to that point. So as Mike said at the start, these last kind of 15 minutes kind of open up to you guys to any questions. I've seen a few flashing up in the Q&A boxes we've gone. So Mike and Jordan, if you want to jump back on with me, and we can take it from there if you have any questions for us.
Sorry, the old chestnut of being on mute. Yeah, thanks, James. I'll give you a few seconds break before I fire some questions at you. So thanks very much. I think we've obviously got about 12 minutes left of the presentation or the webinar. So I will try and fire through as many questions as possible. Some of the questions are actually really interesting, really detailed in around sort of policy and what you should be doing. So we probably won't be able to do justice in terms of a full answer on this call, but what we will try and do as a panel is try and give you a kind of general overview, and obviously we can pick up after this if required. But a couple of the quick ones, which as I'm handling the questions, I'll deal with before passing the more interesting ones out to James and Joe. But just very quickly, quite a lot of people have asked about this presentation on this webinar, so we will be sharing the recording of this. So anybody that's registered, we will be sending out the recording for you to look again, or if there's any sort of key parts that you want to look at, then obviously you can go through those and work from it. We had a couple of questions about the statistics. So the majority, if not all, were taken from the Office of National Statistics. So most of those were from there. So then in terms of sort of more policy and other items, we've had quite a few questions which are around the same kind of concept, and probably as expected because of the nature of sort of working now is around home working. And I think I'll just summarize a couple of questions just to throw to the panel. But I think one of the the first ones is sort of how are companies adapting their policies now to home workers? Is there anything particular that people or companies need to be aware of? Does it just come down to kind of terminology about where the workplace is? Because I know that's one thing you picked up on, James, earlier, but is there anything else that we need to be aware of as a company?
Yeah, so yeah, if I answer that one, Mike, yeah, I think in terms of the policy, as you say, it's definitely a good time to look to update your policy and the terminology and the definitions that are within there. Even obviously pre-COVID, we deal with a lot of clients that had home working, but obviously now that's something that is a lot larger. So we definitely recommend a review of the policy and the definitions within that, and also looking at how you will conduct testing if you do have a suspicion potentially with somebody who is working from home. Again, just making sure that you've got really robust really robust procedures in place of how you will kind of get that person to be tested. I think I saw a couple of messages in the chat just around that particular question in terms of how do we go about testing somebody that we suspect might be under the influence. I think our stance at the moment is that really testing at home isn't considered to be the right option to go down. We would definitely recommend inviting that person into an office, into a neutral location to do the testing. Again, we could talk probably at quite length around some of the reasons why we don't feel home testing is quite right at the moment for somebody, especially if there is a suspicion that they are under the influence of alcohol or drugs. But that's definitely our approach. And we've also worked with clients recently just around their random testing programs, and again have gone down sort of a similar route where those individuals will be asked to attend a central location or a neutral location to have their testing completed.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. Even as we speak, the questions are flying in. So I'm just going to try and get a few. I'm just going to fire them out because the few are quite specific ones. So one of them, which I suppose comes down to why you're testing in the first place, but one of the questions is, what are the pros and cons between for cause testing and random testing?
Yeah. So obviously for cause testing is normally carried out when there is a suspicion or there's a reason for completing that test. Random testing is more proactive, a little bit of can't think of what the word is, but just it's part of your program. So you're not testing that group of people because there is a suspicion. It's just part of the program. Everybody knows that's part of the policy. You could turn up to work on Monday and be tested. Whereas a for cause, you shouldn't hide random testing. Sorry, you shouldn't hide for cause testing under random testing, which we do, again, sort of have that question asked quite a few times. If you do have a suspicion with somebody, it should be approached and dealt with as a for cause and go through sort of the procedure, again, that you've got in place to deal with those sorts of cases. Random testing is more sort of proactive and preventative, really.
It's a very powerful deterrent, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. So just a couple of ones, and I'm just going to pick one out because I know it's something that we get asked quite a lot. It's one of the key questions from a drug testing perspective, and one of them is, the question is about sort of cannabis levels and the use of legal CBD products. And I think the key thing here, very quickly, is that if it's a legal CBD product, it won't have the levels of THC in it, which would make it illegal effectively. Sort of 0.2% of sort of THC in the CBD product makes it a legally bought substance that you could get from Holland & Barrett or any other legitimate sources. So if that was the case and the person was taking legally bought CBD products, it wouldn't actually show up on our test. So it wouldn't flag. So that kind of sort of answers that. And like I said, that's a very common sort of question we get asked quite a bit. The other question, which I suppose would be fairly straightforward to ask, one of them is, how do we deal with staff drinking in a lunch break who are in safety critical roles?
I suppose that would all depend on the terminology again of your policy and what dictates a lunch break, whether someone is receiving pay to be on lunch and therefore still at work, or unpaid lunch where you're then at leave. But again, it's still, I suppose Mark and Joel agree with me on this one, it's still individual decisions when someone chooses to drink, and being on lunch or after work or before work, it's still about them making the right choices. So it does always come back to the policy and the terminology and the wording of what defines their lunch break. Or like I said, is it unpaid leave or paid leave to take that lunch break? I.e., if you're being paid to go to lunch, you're still at work regardless if you leave the premises, because you're still being paid for your time. So it's all about terminology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just picking up on that point, the policy process, the kind of development of your policy as a business, and the regular review of that to make sure it is robust and operationally effective is, and we've always advised this for the many years that we've been doing it, is that is your first port of call, because everything kind of falls back to your policy. So when you do have incidents like this, or you have a situation where you either want to introduce random testing, or whether you have a for cause situation, the definitions within your policy and what you can and can't do are very important, and actually will affect the whole process in terms of implementing testing, doing the testing, and obviously managing any kind of fallout from that testing. So there's been loads of questions about policy reviews and how we can support with that, which is something we do all the time. So if anybody does want us to kind of any help and advice around policies, then definitely get in touch. You can see the contact information on the screen at the moment. So I'm conscious of time. We've got about 4 minutes to go, so I'll try and fire a couple more. One of the questions was about what drugs are tested for in our kind of offering. I mean, the key thing here, I'm not going to test anybody's memory and pronunciations, but the key thing from a drug perspective is the two main methods we use is urine or oral fluid. From a kind of a urine perspective, and we have a kind of 10 panel or a 6 panel sort of drug testing cup for urine and a cube for oral fluid, but it does cover the main sort of drugs that would potentially be picked up on a workplace perspective. So things like amphetamines, cocaine, THC, opiates, ketamine, few others. Benzodiazepines,
a few more. Cannabis will be in there. Opioids. You'd get benzodiazepines. You'd get propoxyphene, which is a painkiller, a barbiturate. There's all different things you can look for depending on the drug types you need to look for. But as Mike said, all the very commonly known abused substances, be that illegal or illegal that's being abused.
Yeah,
absolutely. And then just picking up on that, there's been a couple of questions around different other drugs, so steroids and also synthetic drugs. So the key point here is that although we're using what we call point of care kits, which is the on-site tests, although they wouldn't pick up on sort of synthetic drugs or steroids, it is something that we can support with kind of enhanced screening. This is where we can collect the sample from site and it goes to our lab for enhanced screening, where we can kind of detail exactly what's in the sample. So if you ever get a situation where you do have concerns on certain substances like that, then we can definitely advise on the best route and how you can handle those type of situations. So I think we've potentially got a chance for one more, because I'm conscious it cuts off in 2 minutes. So somebody's asked about kind of awareness posters and sort of general awareness items. So they've asked, is there anything available and how they go about that? So I suppose from our side, so James, do you want to, because of obviously your background on the training side, do you want to kind of cover that off?
Yeah, so with the post, obviously delivering training, when we're delivering training, there's many avenues you can go down, toolbox talks, poster campaigns, email campaigns, obviously through the sales inquiries and through the bookings team, as well as the training that we deliver. There are many paraphernalia, posters, campaigns, handouts, leaflets that we can provide with additional information on, whether that's in line with training or support networks. Yeah, it's definitely something we can do and look into.
Yeah, we also kind of tailor those materials around the business and the policy as well. So again, it's bespoke to your organisation. So if you are, working in a haulage company, it's kind of, again, you've kind of got the imagery and everything that sits around that business. So it's a bit kind of tailored, which is good. Fantastic.
We have hit 1 o'clock, so I'm not sure if we're still live, but if we are, just want to say thank you, massive thank you to James for all his work into this, and Joanne as well for helping the questions. And if you are still listening, thanks very much for joining. And like I said, please contact us for any further information. So thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
you.